Hey everybody, what's happening? Danny the Count Koker here. We're hanging out in beautiful Snoqualmie Casino. You know me from Counting Cars on History. You also know me from Count 77, and that's why we're here tonight. We're here to rock out here in Snoqualmie. You are watching Eclectic Arts, man, and I'm glad to be here.
There's a black bandana that has covered the same man's head for more than a decade of television. And somehow, it became one of the most argued about pieces of fabric on the internet. People built entire theories around it. They built theories around his silence, his absences, his marriage, and even whether he was still alive. For years, Danny Koker let those stories exist without saying a word. Now, at 62, he's finally putting some of them to rest. And a few of his answers are not what fans expected. So which rumors turned out to be true? Which ones were nonsense from the start? And what does the Count actually have to say for himself? Let's get into it. Danny Koker built his name the old-fashioned way, long before reality television ever noticed him. In Las Vegas, in the world of collectors and restorers who actually knew classic cars inside and out, he already had a reputation as someone who could look at a rusted-out shell in a barn and see a six-figure restoration. That reputation is what caught the attention of producers working on Pawn Stars. He started showing up as the guy they called in whenever something automotive and unusual rolled through the pawn shop doors, and audiences liked him instantly. He was blunt, knowledgeable, and clearly in love with what he did. That combination was enough for History Channel to hand him his own show. And in 2012, Counting Cars premiered as a spin-off built entirely around Danny and his shop, Count's Customs. From the very first season, the format was simple and effective. Danny and his crew would track down a forgotten classic, argue about what it was worth, and then transform it into something spectacular while cameras rolled. Viewers didn't just tune in for the cars, though. They tuned in for Danny himself, the guy in the bandana with the deep voice and the rock and roll attitude, who talked about carburetors and vintage sheet metal like other people talk about their kids. Over 10 seasons, that persona became inseparable from the brand. Say the word Count to anyone who watched cable television in the 2010s, and they know exactly who you mean. Part of what made the show work was that Count's Customs never felt like a set built for television. It looked and operated like a real working shop because it was one filled with people who'd spent years learning how to bring dead engines and rusted frames back to life. Danny positioned himself less as a showman and more as someone genuinely obsessed with a history sitting inside every vehicle that rolled through the garage doors. He'd talk about a car's production numbers, its original paint codes, or the specific reasons a particular model mattered to collectors, and none of it felt performed. That authenticity is arguably what let the show run as long as it did in a genre where plenty of similar programs burn out after a season or two. But the longer a show runs and the bigger a personality becomes, the more the internet wants to pick it apart. And Counting Cars ran long enough, and Danny became famous enough, that eventually the rumors started arriving faster than anyone could keep track of. The first and probably most persistent one was about his health. At some point, corners of the internet decided Danny was seriously ill, and the specific illness depended on which clickbait article you happened to land on. Some said cancer. Others were vaguer, just hinting at a serious condition, without ever citing anything real. The rumor picked up steam any time Danny spent a stretch of time away from television, because absence, to a certain kind of internet audience, always reads as evidence of something being wrong. None of these stories were ever backed by a statement from Danny, his family, or anyone connected to Count's Customs. They were built entirely on speculation and repetition, which is often all a rumor needs to survive online. It's a pattern that plays out constantly with reality television personalities. A star steps back from the screen for a season, or simply ages in front of the camera the way everyone does, and somewhere a website decides that's newsworthy enough to spin into a health scare. Once one low-traffic site runs the headline, aggregator pages start recycling it. Video essays start narrating it. And within a week, it looks like a widely reported story, even though it traces back to a single unverified claim. Danny's case followed that exact template for years, with no hospital record, no family statement, and no credible outlet ever actually confirming any of it. Then there was the legal trouble angle, and this one at least had a real event buried somewhere inside it. even if the rumor twisted what actually happened. In 2016, Counts Customs filed a civil lawsuit against a former employee, alleging he'd misused tens of thousands of dollars in company funds on personal expenses, and that the fallout had also landed the business with a hefty IRS penalty. It was a real lawsuit filed by the business against someone who used to work there. But headlines don't always make that distinction clear, and plenty of readers walked away thinking Danny Koker himself had been the one facing legal trouble, maybe even criminal charges. He wasn't. A separate civil dispute followed a few years later, when a Las Vegas couple sued the shop over a Mustang restoration that they said fell apart, with delays, miscommunication, and a car that wasn't even the model they'd asked for. Again, a real civil case, and again, something that got flattened into vague Danny's in trouble gossip by the time it made the rounds online. And then there was the rumor that topped all the others for sheer absurdity, that Danny had died. More than once, posts circulated claiming he'd passed away, some accompanied by doctored images or fake obituary-style headlines. There's never anything real behind any of it, no official statement, no news report, nothing beyond manufactured panic designed to get clicks and shares. It's a strange but common pattern with public figures who go quiet for even a short stretch of time, and Danny got hit with it more than once. His personal life didn't escape the internet's imagination either. Danny and his wife, Corey, have generally kept their marriage out of the spotlight, choosing not to turn their relationship into content the way some reality stars do. To some corners of the fan base, that privacy read as suspicious instead of simply personal, and it spiraled into unfounded theories about the state of their marriage. At one particularly strange point, false reports even claimed Corey had died in a car accident. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity, a totally different woman sharing the same name, and Corey herself eventually had to make clear that the story was completely false. Even something as small as Danny's bandana wasn't safe from speculation, because he wore it in nearly every public appearance, without exception. People assumed there had to be a reason hiding underneath it. Some guessed scarring from an accident. Others tied it back to the same cancer rumors, imagining it was covering the effects of treatment. It became one of those small mysteries that fans obsessed over precisely because Danny never addressed it directly for years. What made all of this stranger is that Danny wasn't the type to respond. Throughout his run on television, he built a reputation as someone who preferred to talk about the work in front of him rather than his own personal life. Whether he was at a car show, performing with his band, or doing press for the shop, the conversation almost always stayed on classic cars, music, and business. He didn't do the thing a lot of public figures do, where every rumor gets an immediate public rebuttal. Instead, he mostly let the noise exist and kept working. For a lot of fans, that silence became part of the mystery itself. If the rumors weren't true, why wasn't he saying so? Then, around 2021, the show that had made him famous quietly stopped producing new episodes after nearly a decade on the air. There was no big farewell special, no dramatic send-off, just reruns filling the time slot where new episodes used to be. And because nobody explained why, fans did what fans always do. They filled in the blanks themselves. Some assumed the lawsuits had finally caught up with the business. Others guessed there had been a falling out behind the scenes, especially as familiar faces from the early seasons, like original shop manager Scott Jones and detailer Rolly Sabo, gradually stopped appearing on screen. A few even speculated the whole operation was quietly shutting down for good. Reality shows rarely announce their own endings the way scripted series do, and that silence tends to breed exactly this kind of guesswork. Networks quietly stop ordering seasons for all sorts of unglamorous reasons, shifting ratings priorities, contract negotiations, a format that simply run its natural course. And none of those reasons make for a satisfying explanation to a fan base that spent a decade watching every week. So instead of a boring practical answer, the vacuum got filled with theories about collapse, conflict, and scandal, because those stories are simply more interesting to share than the network moved on. None of that turned out to be accurate, and over time, through interviews and public appearances rather than one big dramatic announcement, Danny has gradually addressed a lot of it. Take the bandana first, since it's probably the most asked about detail of his entire public image. According to Danny himself, the real reason is almost disappointingly simple. It covers a receding hairline. That's it. No accident, no illness, no hidden scar. It started as a practical choice and turned into a signature look almost by accident. The same way his love of vintage cars and rock music became part of his identity. What fans spent years treating as evidence of some hidden condition was, in reality, just a guy who found a look that worked for him and stuck with it. He's also weighed in over various interviews on the question of how real counting cars actually was. It's a fair question to ask about any reality show, and Danny hasn't pretended the format was pure documentary footage. He's been upfront that television requires editing, that a restoration taking weeks or months has to be compressed into something that fits inside a 44-minute episode, and that the story gets shaped around the most compelling moments. But he's also maintained consistently that the shop itself, the employees, and the vehicles were never fabricated for the cameras. Count's Customs existed as a working restoration business long before any producer showed up, and the crew members weren't hired actors playing mechanics. The polish of television editing is real. The underlying business, according to Danny, is real too. As for what happened to the show, and to Danny's career after the cameras stopped rolling regularly, the answer turns out to be a lot less dramatic than the rumors suggested. Count's Customs never closed. It's still operating out of Las Vegas, still taking on restoration and custom projects. And the showroom is still open to visitors who want to browse the vehicles and pick up merchandise. The business Danny built his name on didn't disappear when the network stopped ordering new episodes. It just kept doing what it had always done, minus the film crew. Danny himself hasn't disappeared from public life either. He's just shifted how he shows up. In 2026, he launched a new podcast and video series called Count's Culture, co-hosted with fellow musician Stoney Curtis, blending car culture, rock and roll, and long-form conversations with guests from music, business, and the automotive world. It's a format that gives him something television never really allowed: total creative control, no strict runtime, no network notes shaping the story around commercial breaks. His first guests included rock broadcaster Eddie Trunk, and the show has continued pulling in figures from music and beyond for loose, unscripted conversations recorded at Count's Customs itself. He's also stayed visible through appearances with old friends, including sitting down with Rick Harrison for an episode of Pawn After Dark, giving longtime fans a look at where his life and career have landed since Counting Cars wound down. His finances tell a similar story of quiet stability rather than collapse. Danny has never published an official net worth figure himself, but celebrity wealth trackers place his estimated worth somewhere in the range of $13 to $15 million, built through the shop, his television career, various business ventures, and his personal collection of classic cars. That's not the profile of a business in freefall, which is exactly what a chunk of the online speculation had assumed. Music, meanwhile, never actually went anywhere for Danny. Long before the Count was a household name, he was already a fixture of the Las Vegas rock scene, and he's remained the lead vocalist of Count 77, a band that's kept performing for years regardless of what was happening with his television career. Not everything has stayed exactly the same, though. Count's vamped Rock Bar and Grill, the live music venue he ran in Las Vegas for around 16 years, was sold in 2025. Closing that particular chapter, even as Danny has stayed active in the local music scene in other ways. He's also continued putting time into causes that rarely make headlines the way his TV career did. Danny has donated custom-built vehicles and taken part in fundraising events for organizations like Janie's Fund, the charity founded by Steven Tyler to support vulnerable girls and young women, and Camp Freedom, which provides outdoor experiences for disabled veterans, first responders, and their families. It's a kind of work that doesn't generate viral headlines, but it's been a consistent part of his life away from the shop floor. Looking at the full picture now, what stands out is how far the rumors drifted from reality. There was no secret illness, no criminal case against Danny personally, no hidden tragedy behind the bandana, and no quiet collapse of the business that made him famous. What actually happened is a lot more ordinary. A television show ran its natural course after a decade on the air. A guy who never loved talking about himself kept doing the same thing he'd always done, and the parts of his life that mattered most to him, the shop, the music, the charity work, kept moving forward with, or without a camera pointed at them. Danny Koker spent years letting the internet write its own version of his story, while he stayed focused on the actual work. Now that some of the real answers are finally out there, they're a lot less dramatic than the rumors, but in a way, that says more about him than any scandal ever could. So here's the real question for you. After hearing his side of it, do you think the internet judged him too fast? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's plenty more where this came from.